Deep in the mountains of an unnamed portion of Eastern Europe, a small town would be taken over by the orders of Mother Miranda. With her 4 failed experiments in power on a more local level, one in particular, known as Lady Dimitrescu, would commit atrocities in her family's castle high above the town. Using the townspeople to satiate her need for blood, many monsters and abominations would be brought to life within the castle walls, as well as acts of cannibalism and the creation of scarecrows. So now that the internet has stopped having like an unquenchable feeling for Lady Dimitrescu, I feel now is kind of the perfect time to be discussing her lore and morphology and why exactly she grew the way she did, as well as discuss what is going on with her daughters and their abilities to shapeshift into just clouds of bugs. So let's get to that, shall we? To understand exactly what's going on with Lady Dimitrescu and why she has changed in some ways and actually may not have in others, I think a good place to start would be her actual history, which has led her to where she ended up today, and how the events of the past would shape her 9'6" future. So the first thing to know about Lady Dimitrescu, which, okay, alright, we're gonna do this one time for real, so I know her name, but I'm American, and it's just not my accent. It's Lady Dimitrescu, but I can't pronounce that consistently, so we're gonna go with Dimitrescu, or maybe even Dimitrescu, I don't know. Anyways, this is going to blow your mind, but she's actually human. Thanks for watching. Based on her age, or apparent age currently, it is assumed that she's about 44 or at minimum in her mid-40s. Now that would be fine, except for the locals have been afraid of her for over 60 years at this point. Because of these two timelines added up, that would put us right at about the beginning of the Great War when Lady Dimitrescu was actually born. During this time frame, many upheavals across Europe were taking place. Known as the War to End All Wars, eventually the United States would bust in, take names, and do what America does. And I say this because I know it'll rustle the jimmies of Wisefish when he hears this.
Yeah, well, we saved your ass in World War III.
That's true.
But apart from Team America coming in at the end of World War I and also subsequently the end of World War II, many changes would take place within the European culture during these 30 years that would not be so favorable for Lady Dimitrescu. Prior to World War I, but diminishing greatly afterwards and outright abolished after World War II, nobility, lords, functional kings and queens, basically a ruling class based on birthright, were all very common across Europe. This was one of the determining factors that led to so much bloodshed as allies of allies of allies were brought into conflict with nations that they didn't even really care about based on the ruling class. But this would ultimately come to end as people, not so much the nobility, were the ones who would go on to actually engage in battle on a large scale. After the conclusion of specifically World War II, it became apparent that a ruling class like this needed to be dismantled if a war like this was to be avoided in the future, which would actually go on to be relatively successful right up until we kick off World War III in about 7 years. Eventually, new forms of government were elected in to enforce the will of the people, not just the will of the few, though arguably, is that really what happened? But that doesn't matter. What really matters is that just prior to this upheaval, Lady Dimitrescu was born into the noble Dimitrescu family. However, this family had issues genetically, and she would go on to inherit a blood disorder that would later make her bloodlust near unquenchable. Lady Dimitrescu would go on to age naturally through time, having survived the Great War, but prior to World War II, her family would continue living in the castle back at the village, controlling everything on a local level. As the 1930s rolled around, jazz became more popular, which would be a quasi-precursor to the blues, which would be the beginnings of the best genre known as rock. She would go on to actually have a band named Miss D and the Paul Boys. But as we all know, the 1930s means that things are about to get real bad real fast. And the conclusion of World War II led to the complete abolition of the nobility in general, stripping them of all their power. Alcina would return back to her family's homestead only to find that it had fallen under control of a neo-pagan cult worshipping something known as the Black God. The reason she returned there in the first place was that she was lured back by the cult leader, Mother Miranda, prior to 1958. I mean, maybe some alarm bells should have gone off, considering she was being brought to the crypt beneath the village cemetery, but no time to think about that now. Once down there, she was surgically implanted with the cadou parasite, and Miranda's reasoning for this was attempting to understand if she was a good candidate to whom she could become a host for the parasitic intelligence later on. However, this implant showed that Lady Dimitrescu was in fact not a capable host. Instead, it in turn caused mutations to begin forming, some good and some bad. Concerning the good, she had regenerative powers and she no longer aged. Offensively, she could grow massive claws at will, and if things had got bad enough, she was capable of turning into a giant dragon-like monster, but we will go over that in a bit. Once back in her castle, Miranda would see that she pretty much just belonged there, considering her family had always been there, and her along with 3 others were given lordship over the village to basically run things so Miranda didn't have to micromanage while she found a suitable host for her daughter. During this time frame, however, Lady Dimitrescu would continue to commit atrocities on the town's people that were brought brought up to her castle. In fact, much like the other lords, she would conduct her own experiments on them, with the cadou being the centralized focus to learn the effects. For the females that worked the castle, they would become the Moroika, who would develop wings and were capable of sustained flight on the outside of the castle, but for some reason, only women were kept around as actual infected. Any males brought to the castle were eaten, hollowed out, and then put up in the vineyards as scarecrows. And also, it should be noted, there is another version which wanders the dungeons known as the, I'm gonna butcher this, Samaka, but I'm actually planning on having videos over those separately. Anyhow, with the village people well aware of what was happening at the castle, they learned to fear the cruelty of Alcina, but could do very little to rectify the issue. One man in particular attempted to end this horrendous treatment by stealing the dagger of death's flower and would attempt to take out Lady Dimitrescu, but was discovered and ultimately would fail to do so. He was entombed with the poison blade that Ethan would eventually discover and then stick into the side of Lady Dimitrescu to stop her healing factor. With this failed attempt, the experiments would continue, and that would ultimately result in the creation of Bella, Daniela, and Cassandra, which we will talk about before moving on to the biology of Alcina Dimitrescu. Bella being the oldest, Cassandra being the middle, and Daniela being the youngest were all assumed to be maids of the castle and actually in no way are related to Lady Dimitrescu. However, after their experimentation, they would be adopted by the lady as her daughters. This experimentation resulted in the complete decimation of their previous form. After their expiration by unknown means, blowflies were then born out of the cadou parasite, and those were applied to their bodies. Eventually, all human cells were eaten and their genetic code would be incorporated into the parasite because, again, its association with the mold, as mentioned in several of my videos, has the ability to interact with human DNA and alter genes, such as increasing mitotic division to heal Ethan from egregious wounds. These blowflies have consumed this genetic code, would also have access to how they looked, talked, moved, and in general would be as a human. However, being completely composed of blowflies, the reality is they're not even remotely human and instead were just completely insectoid. Being able to take on a human form at will or turn into a cloud of blowflies, they could quickly make their way around the castle and entrap any who would be trying to escape. Typically, these were the witches responsible for draining the workers at the castle as well, taking them to the basement and then eating them. However, there is one critical issue with these blowflies. Because they are insectoid and not capable of regulating body temperature and instead are reliant on external environments, this meant that introduction of cold would slow their metabolism down, much like what is considered normal for any other insect, with kind of one of the interesting exceptions, if you didn't know, being bees, who actually flap their wings in the summer at the entrance of the beehive to cool it down. But blowflies would not be capable of keeping warmth. Introduction of any temperature below 50 degrees would make these insects go into an almost subdued state, completely losing their ability to repair and regenerate, making them vulnerable to damage. Because of this, considering they are in a small mountain village during what is the dead of winter, being February, the daughters cannot exit the castle for any reason unless they want to quickly succumb to the cold. This being a glaring weakness, Ethan is able to utilize this to introduce cooler temperatures onto the bugs, which in turn would slow down their metabolisms. It would seem that prior to this realization, any hits to the body of the insect would never do any damage because it's really just a facade on the outside, but nothing more than a writhing mass of insects internally. When the lead would take out some, they would either repair their own bodies or more insects would be born out of what was already there, essentially meaning that they were able to likely reabsorb the destroyed bugs and then create more. With the introduction of the cold, this reabsorption would likely not take place in any real capacity, likely due to the subduing of the mold, meaning that if enough damage was inflicted on the bug suit, there really is no coming back, which we see when the sisters are destroyed. Each one, upon receiving enough damage, is still cognitively aware that they are changing and is still actively attempting to attack Ethan, but with the mold, it appears to be a fickle thing. It would seem that some sort of chemical reaction is taking place within the mold, and if it's stopped for long enough, a runaway calcification of the mold would begin, resulting in the expiration of the host. With the daughters, as enough blowflies are destroyed, the calcification begins, even though the bugs composing the head are still capable of speaking and appear to have a collective consciousness. Ultimately, it does not matter as the calcification process continues and then destroys the rest of the bugs entirely. Eventually, using this knowledge, Ethan was able to overcome the daughters, but this attracts the ire of Alcina Dimitrescu. Seeing as you just ended her only real companions who have likely been around her for as long as she has, this now brings us into what is actually going on with Lady Dimitrescu and why she is the way she is. Throughout the lore of this game, a blood disease is kind of vaguely mentioned throughout for the 9'6" vampire GF, but it's not explicitly said as to what she is currently struggling with. But if we look at the context clues, they're all showing what she has likely inherited, and I mean, I'm just gonna go ahead and say this is what she's inherited. Concerning the parasite specifically, it is not capable of fixing genetic issues. It is really only there to manipulate what is currently in the coding, allowing for new physiological traits to evolve. Again, for Lady Dimitrescu, these are things like her height gain, which which you might find a little strange, but we will cover that. Her healing factor, which Ethan also possesses, which I hope by now isn't a spoiler because we have literally seen his foot be cut off in Resident Evil 7, and he was able to reattach it, or for that matter, when Lady Dimitrescu uses one of her physiological changes, such as the ability to grow claws, which then she subsequently uses to cut Ethan's hand off, and then he goes on to kind of reattach it later. Basically, the whole point here, there is a lot of healing factors going on. The mold is able to change specifically for the claws, the lacuna of the nail and its genetic predisposition concerning growth to create larger nails at will so that she can use them offensively. The mold is also able to absolutely heal Alcina, as well as when it comes to putting lead into her body, as she seems unaffected until her dragon form, which we will cover later, but this still doesn't explain what the disease she has currently affecting her genetics and in turn makes her need blood in order to survive. The first clue we have as to what Lady Dimitrescu may be suffering from is her aversion to sunlight. She wears a full-length gown and large hats, which is not just by happenstance. She also wears gloves to cover up her skin, but she can go outside, meaning that she is not composed to blowflies like her daughters. Instead, she regularly must exit the castle and can follow Ethan outside into the courtyard quite readily as he tries to run out there. Next, her love of blood is a second clue as to what she has. As far as we know, the daughters only need blood and meat because they're literally insects that need to pass around sustenance internally to keep their own metabolisms going. With Alcina, however, she does not so much need to eat a man's flesh, but instead needs the blood of humans, such as with the maiden blood mixed with grapes that she has hidden deep in the castle. Ultimately, the key here is she's mixing blood with grapes, likely because she's not craving blood, but instead needs it for a specific purpose. The next thing, which is a very small detail that people pointed out in the trailer saying, wow, someone took a lot of time to put details on her skin, but really what it's showing us is minor scarring is taking place specifically where the sun may be hitting her skin if the hat doesn't cover it, nor does the actual gown she wears, because we also see similar scarring on her face. And this scarring is intentionally shown because it's actually critical to figuring out what specific blood disease she has. With all these clues lining up, it's fairly clear that she's actually struggling with a liver disease known as Porphyria. So what in the name of all that is holy is Porphyria? Well, I'm here to slap down the knowledge. Porphyria is an insidious disease that is treatable and is typically inherited genetically from your parents, but in a lot of cases, environmental triggers are what cause it to surface. There are quite a few different versions of the disease, but the main thing to know is that it's a liver disorder where porphyrins build up in the body and can have detrimental impacts on the nervous system and skin of a person. But what is a porphyrin, I hear you asking? Well, specifically in this instance, it's a conglomeration of amino acids and ligands that, pertaining at least to iron-containing porphyrins, would be a precursor to hemes, essentially what your red blood cells use to transport oxygen around the body. Now, to properly use a porphyrin, you need a specific enzyme within the body to begin building the red blood cells to properly use the porphyrin in that aspect. However, some people have liver issues where they do not produce enough of this enzyme, which can ultimately lead to a buildup in their body. There are two versions known as acute porphyrias and chronic porphyrias. Specifically pertaining to Lady Dimitrescu, I would hazard a guess as to say it's the latter over the former. Acute porphyrias specifically pertains to the nervous system attacks and results in abdominal pain, vomiting, hypertension, and tachycardia, and can in some cases lead to weakness in muscle as well as paralysis if not treated. With Alcina, she likely suffers from chronic porphyrias, which results in cutaneous porphyrias. Now you're probably asking yourself, well, cutaneous is referring to skin, but how does it work? Well, when the sunlight hits a skin of a person with this specific disease, it causes a whole host of issues to begin forming. Porphyrins are naturally photoactive, and when sunlight is introduced directly, this causes them to have a higher energy resting state. Because of this, more energy is released than normal within the skin of this person, and thus damage is locally caused based on the amount of porphyrins focused in that area. As you might imagine, this causes sensitivity in the skin, and in some cases can cause an immense amount of pain in that area exposed directly to the sunlight. Usually within about 30 minutes of sun exposure, the afflicted would complain of discomfort, burning, and in general pain in those areas that the sun has shone upon, which can lead to other problems. In extreme cases, physical deformities may begin to build up to those who suffer this, but in more mild cases, blistering and scarring on small scales are quite common, which may be indicative of what we have seen with the skin of Lady Dimitrescu. Someone suffering from this genetic disease would obviously limit their exposure to sunlight either via longer clothing, larger hats, umbrellas, anything to avoid direct contact, or they may limit actually how often they venture outside to only the necessities. Other symptoms of this disease would be a discoloration of the skin, which we have seen on Lady Dimitrescu, and the extremely pale skin, obviously from being limited to going outside. With this disease linking up with the context clues we have seen concerning how Alcina acts and why she favors the blood of people, the question is then, why does she do this? Well, it's known one of the ways to actually reduce the porphyrins within in the body is to help them along to the actual molecule that they are supposed to be adjoining. There are a few ways depending on severity that this can be done. In mild cases, things like avoiding sunlight would be beneficial as you are actually still producing the enzymes needed, just not as many. In extreme cases, you might just straight up need blood transfusions. When the porphyrins build up too much in the body and your body is not necessarily making the enzymes necessary to clear them, one way to stop an acute attack and treat the disease is to give a person a blood transfusion, increasing the heme in the body to stop it from making so many porphyrins, or to actually just draw the blood out of the body to decrease the amount of iron within the person, thus also decreasing the porphyrins. Specifically with the blood transfusions is the one I want to focus on. It would appear to me that Lady Dimitrescu has gone in favor of sucking blood rather than going after blood transfusions. While the normal human way of thinking would be a transfusion, the cadou parasite influence over her has pushed her to consume blood rather than address the problem. Ultimately, as long as the blood enters the body, it would still in some capacity receive the enzymes and nutrition from the blood itself, which also, here comes another important thing to have, vitamin D, which I just covered in my Daybreakers episode. I swear, all these vampires. But consuming the blood of a person would provide those nutrients needed as well as the enzymes necessary to keep porphyrins from reaching critical levels in her own blood, which would also injure her in the process. She may actually be better served to use a transfusion technique in reality, but again, due to the parasite being largely at the helm, brutality was more favorable. And the last thing we need to discuss is the height she has obtained and why, which may actually be explained by her final dragon-like form, this exists. It's clear that this gal is tall as all get out. Again, standing at 9 feet 6 inches or 2.9 meters tall, she towers over all the other lords and infected except for Urias. After her infection with the cadou, this led her to skyrocket in height, as prior she was still likely about normal height for a woman of that era. So the question is why? Well, that's the issue. I mean, it's always been the issue. Height is a pretty fickle thing. The reality is our bodies have a range of heights based on genetics and donation of genes from the mother and father. However, it isn't a dead set thing either. Some may have a height range of 5'4" to 5'8" and really only achieve 5'2" or might even achieve 5'10", while others may have a range of 5'10" to 6'4" but achieve below or above or even that as well. It's really predicated on nutrition and how your body grows during puberty. The reality is it's really more of a guess as to why some people are taller than their parents, but others might be shorter than theirs. The Punnett square offers some clarity as the transfer of genes and what is to be expected, but even then, a range still exists. It seems that whatever is in Lady Dimitrescu likely may be mutated or damaged in some way. Taking into account the blood disease he has and the propensity for nobles to be somewhat inbred back in the day, it's entirely possible these issues are having an impact via the mold and how it expresses these genes. So just to recap, the mold absolutely influences gene expression within the body, and as such, it can cause you to heal, mutate, or in general change your phenotypic traits based on your genotypic ones. With Lady Dimitrescu, that's what I believe is happening. While in her unaltered human form, she may have been normal height, and it's clear there are some genetic issues with her family and within her. Because of this, ones that may have been displayed as much, such as height, are being affected as well. And this caused her to fall within the average range because there are actually many height genes in our coding if you didn't know. However, upon her infection and tampering of the genetic coding within her body, this gene would have a more profound impact on her post-infection height and maybe ushering in an almost constant growth. For example, whereas the other genes may have programmed her height to say end by about age 18 and then no longer be pushing the bones to lengthen, a faulty gene may have pushed her to continue to grow in her normal form, but extremely slowly, which may not have been noticeable to her. Then after her infection, that one gene that is no longer silent or was never silent concerning growth is still pushing for growth, which the mold reads as something it needs to continue on, sort of like genes that push for repair of muscle or skin mitosis. With the gene constantly switched on, this would over the last 60 years cause Dimitrescu to become larger and larger, but ultimately this would have spelled her end too, which is why she's not a compatible host. Eventually she would reach the square cube law where she would be so large her body could not support that weight nor the height requirements, likely leading her to become a mass of flesh like we have seen with others, or maybe just straight up become what her final form is. When you stab Lady Dimitrescu with the dagger, stopping her healing factor, she turns into a winged beast many times larger than her original self, and subsequently Ethan as well. Capable of flight, this creature is large enough and heavy enough to destroy structures and an entire tower. With this size increase, it's possible she could exist for some time, but if she got much larger, again she would run into the square cubed law. Which I find most interesting about this form, however, is that once you do take her out, only the human form is the one that calcifies calcifies from the damage to the mold. The rest of the body still remains, much like an animal taken out would. And this could potentially be because where the dagger hit, anything above the blade was still infected with the mold, whereas due to blood flow and possibly an aorta hit, anything below disseminated the toxin in the body, cleansing it of the infection. So shortly after her transformation, the dragon body below was cleansed of the mold infection, whereas the top portion was still infected, which is what happens to be the area that maintains consciousness. Although, given enough time, it would be entirely possible that the toxin may have continued to circulate and then cleanse the infection. Something I do find interesting is I wonder if there's a possibility that, considering she has turned into this form before, could that have driven her height to be 9'6". So each time she turns back into this dragon form, it pushes her height even further. Because she does say that she has been turned into this form before, meaning that the mold infection she has allows her to return back to a quasi-human form, but maybe without the mold, she may be stuck in this form permanently, which is pretty tragic because, I mean, for a 9'6" woman, I mean, she is kind of